Success! Oh, hi. Glad you're here. I'm glad to be with you. Today I'm going to talk about the most impactful films on my life that were released in 2012. 2012. Good year. The year my son was born. Yeah, man. That's crazy. It's crazy to think of. He just turned 11 last week. Anyway. Dredd. I will mention the movie Dredd. I mentioned the original Judge Dredd in a previous video and how hilarious that movie is. But the Dredd with Carl Urban, aka Cupid and Caesar from Xena, did an amazing job in that film, and it's an amazing film. Like, everyone knows that. The 2012 Dredd is a great, unique, one-of-a-kind, single set-piece action film, and I love it. The Watch. The Watch, a comedy starring Ben Stiller and Vince Vaughn. Vince Vaughn being not only one of my favorite actors, but by far one of my favorite comedic actors of all time. I'd never seen this movie until a couple years later. Then my son's mother showed it to me, and I was like, why have I never seen this? Like, it blew me away with not only what a great movie it was and what a hilarious comedy it was, but the most memorable part about it, and my favorite part about it by far, was it features a cameo by The Lonely Island. And if you haven't seen the movie, I won't spoil their cameo, but it's the most insane, ridiculous, hilarious cameo ever, especially for the three of them. If you have seen the movie, you know what I mean, but it's hilarious. And to see The Lonely Island in anything, especially together, especially in a movie that's not theirs. Did one of them direct this movie? That might have been what it was. I'd have to look into that. I don't remember. I only saw it the once, but it was just I remember that hilarious cameo. This Means War. Now, I'm going to mention this movie. I think I saw it eventually a few years later, but it's an early film with Tom Hardy in a more traditional role, which is weird to see him in a traditional role. But he's a funny guy. He's got comedy chops. But a lot of people don't know what This Means War is. I mean, it's a movie about two spies, fighting over a woman, I believe. But it wasn't until a while after that I realized what this movie was, because years before I had heard murmurs that they were going to make a movie based on the comic strip Spy vs. Spy from Mad Magazine. And I was like, wow, how are they going to do that? And then I went, man, I guess they never made that movie. No, they did. It's This Means War. That movie is actually based on Spy vs. Spy from Mad Magazine. Weird, huh? Chris Pine, yeah. Spring Breakers. Now, Spring Breakers, you might be familiar with being an insane film with a brilliant performance by James Franco. And I was so intrigued by that movie. It got a lot of traction and a lot of buzz and a lot of talk, so I ended up buying it on DVD. I mean, I don't love the movie, but I don't hate the movie. It's very interesting and unique and good for what it is. But the most important thing about this movie is it is the movie that really kick-started A24. Their first big noticed movie that put them on the map. After Spring Breakers, A24 became, like, I believe A24 was actually founded in 2012, so this might have been definitely one of their first, if not their first. Because at first they bought movies to release, to make a name for themselves, and they made a name for themselves real quick, and now they're the most respected, prestigious movie studio ever. They've only been around for 10 years, and they have so many Oscars under their belt. I actually recently learned that at first they were buying movies, but the very first movie that A24 produced on their own was Moonlight, which went on to win Best Picture. And since then, obviously, they just, Everything Everywhere All at Once just won Best Picture. And A24 is now a studio that, if I see A24 tagged onto a movie, I'm going to watch it. And there's a huge A24 fan base. But it all started with that insane film, Spring Breakers, followed by things like Beach Bum. The Avengers. It's crazy that I lived 30 years of my life never thinking that I would see such a thing on film. And now to look back, and that was 11 years ago that the first Avengers movie came out. And I specifically remember it came out, I think it was like the week after my son was born. So having a brand new newborn baby, I wasn't about to go to the movies. Normally that would have been a movie I would have gone to like the first midnight showing, because this was right before they changed midnight showings to earlier. We'll be talking about that in a moment. But I remember living with my mother's, or my son's mother's parents at the time, and her brother went and saw it, and I was like, how was it? Was it good? Did they actually pull it off? And like, yeah. Eventually I saw it, maybe a month or two later, with my dad. I saw it a couple times in theaters, and I'm like, wow, that's pretty good. And now here we are, the MCU being what it is today. But back then the Avengers was a big deal, but now it looks like, a petty little simple film after things like Infinity War and Endgame. But my son will look back, on the year he was born, and in these movies coming out the year he was born, like the Avengers, like the week after he was born, stuff like that. It's pretty monumental. Flight, starring Denzel Washington as a drunk pilot. Amazing film. I remember watching that. I borrowed it from my brother who had it on DVD, and that movie blew my mind. That is such an amazing film with an astounding performance by Denzel Washington. I highly recommend it. I remember how impactful it was on me. But the most impactful part I remember is how ironic it was that I borrowed it from my brother, who, I guess at the time, most of his life, apparently until recently, but anyway, my brother was a severe alcoholic who drank nonstop, including at work. And I just thought it was ironic that he was such a big fan of this movie that had so many similarities of the main character in him. And it just really hit home with me, the kind of damage alcohol abuse can do on yourself, on your friends and family and loved ones, and even innocent bystanders just because they happen to be on a plane you're flying. Great movie. I highly recommend it. Let's skip this one and come back to it, because that's some stuff to say. 21 Jump Street. Talk about a perfect comedy. That's how you do it. If you want to make a movie based on an old television show that has since become kind of outdated and a silly plot or subject matter, undercover cops go into a high school. I watched that show, the original 21 Jump Street, when I was young. And, but that's how you do it. You then make it into a ridiculous satire comedy, and it's perfectly done. And the sequel. But 21 Jump Street blew my mind and was absolutely hysterical. Channing Tatum should only do comedy. Channing Tatum is freaking hilarious. Like his recent movie with Sandra Bullock. Oh, what was it, The Lost City? I love that movie. He's freaking hilarious. So that movie just blew me away for everything it did. My most memorable part is when they do the drug, and then they're talking to the coach. And then, the coach's eyebrows and, the ice cream cone. And that always just was one of the most hilarious scenes ever. Like, I love everything they did in 21 Jump Street. It's a perfect film and a perfect comedy. And in my opinion, one of the greatest comedies ever made. And of course, Phil Lord and Chris Miller, who would then go on to make other brilliant films like the Lego Movie. Wish we would have seen their solo film, but hey, they won an Oscar for Spider-Verse, so 21 Jump Street, great. That's how you do it. That's how you do it. And it still blows my mind. Spoiler alert. It still blows my mind every time I watch that movie that Johnny Depp is in it. And the other guy, his partner from 21 Jump Street, the show. And the way they incorporate not only the actors, but the actual characters from the show in this film, where then canonically, is that the word I'm looking for? Chronologic? No. Canon? Canonically? Anyway, yeah, canonically. Those characters, that's how they die. Like, what a brilliant, brilliant touch to add to a brilliant, brilliant film. 21 Jump Street, fantastic. Battleship, like Brad Bird, that's his name, right? Brad Bird, the guy from Fire in the Sky. I like Battleship. I like it a lot. I ended up borrowing the Blu-ray from a coworker, and in exchange, I let him borrow. I still regret this. I let him borrow one of my favorite childhood books, Star Wars: Tales from Jabba's Palace. And at that time, because this was like a year or so later, some stuff went down and I ended up quitting my job. So I never got my book back, and I still have his Battleship Blu-ray. But I actually really like that movie for what it is, to take a ridiculous board game like Battleship and turn it into a movie. I think they pulled it off. It's really cool. It's really fun. It's really unique. Rihanna. Yeah, I think Battleship is a really good, fun, campy, entertaining, action-packed, creative film that gets crapped all over but deserves a little more credit. It's very underrated. I enjoyed that film. Chronicle. Ooh, Chronicle was like around when the found footage movies were still a big deal, but pretty much the last of its kind as far as us giving a darn or them being really good. But I think Chronicle was done very well. I love what they did with that movie, and the premise alone, with getting these powers and then using them and then having the good one and the bad one, and then they fight, and my introduction to that brilliant actor who ended up playing Green Goblin in the Amazing Spider-Man films. He's a great actor, and we should see him in more stuff. But he was fantastic in Chronicle, an amazing low-budget film that did what it set out to do, and I think it's a great movie. Creative. Especially like it being a found footage film, and then at one point he's using his powers to kind of levitate the camera so that we can get certain shots without it having to be like a specific POV. Brilliant. The Dictator. So I was a huge fan of Sacha Baron Cohen ever since I first saw the Ali G show on HBO. I mean, he did it back in Europe, and then we got it here in America on HBO. And that show blew my mind, all of his characters. And I was thrilled when we got a scripted Ali G in the House film, which is phenomenal, hilarious. Love that movie. And then, of course, we got his most famous Borat, another great film, but that one actually taking from the show where it's all real and real people and real interactions. And then, of course, I was like, well, now we got to get a Bruno movie. And we did get a Bruno movie, and that movie, I believe I've spoken of in a past video, was one of the funniest movies I've ever seen to this day. I absolutely love Bruno. Little tidbit for you. The only thing in the entirety of the movie of Bruno that's scripted is his interview with Harrison Ford. I'm here with Harrison Ford. I don't want to get demonetized, but F off is what Harrison Ford says. Hilarious. My favorite Harrison Ford appearance, especially cameo ever. So Bruno was great. So then, like, well, what's he going to do now? And then he came out of nowhere with another scripted film, much like Ali G in the House, but this time he was introducing a new character. And The Dictator, I think, is an absolutely fantastic, hilarious, brilliant film. I absolutely love it. It's phenomenal. Like that one actor, that's how I got introduced to him, who's been in many things since. But when he's talking about the Wile E. Coyote cartoon, like, it's just, I love The Dictator, an absolutely fantastic film. And then, of course, he went on to do The Brothers Grimsby, but let's not talk about that. That's a great film, and I love it, but all we would be able to talk about is the elephant scene. If you haven't seen The Brothers Grimsby, I dare you, especially if you can find, like, an unrated version, I dare you to sit through that elephant scene. I saw that movie in theaters, and that's, yeah, definitely the most disturbing, horrific, disgusting sequences in film history. There's no doubts there. This is also the year that the animated adaptation of Batman: The Dark Knight Returns. I had never I bought both the part 1 and part 2 on DVD. Specifically, part 1 came out this year and part 2 the next. But I'd never read the Frank Miller comic of The Dark Knight Returns, so I was like, oh, well, let me check out this story. I've heard so many great things about it. And it's great. It's a fantastic adaptation. It's a fantastic animated film. But my favorite part about it is that this older Batman is voiced by Peter Weller. The man, the myth, the legend, Peter Weller. Most people just know him as RoboCop, the original, which, yes, he's brilliant in the original RoboCop films. But he's brilliant in everything. There's so many movies he's done that I'm a huge fan of. One of them in particular is called, dang it, what is it called? Dang it, it's the underwater one. Where there's a monster and it starts with a P. It's not Prometheus. I always say that. I always say Prometheus, but it's not. I can't remember, but it doesn't matter because that's not the movie we're talking about. We're just talking about how amazing Peter Weller is. Oh, like in Buckaroo Banzai and the 10th Dimension, or so. It's got a great title. But Buckaroo Banzai, if you haven't seen that, fantastic. Young Jeff Goldblum and what's his face from Lost. Anyway, Buckaroo Banzai, look that up. It's insane. Christopher Lloyd, like, it's insane, and it's so much fun, and one of the most ridiculous films ever. So I'm a huge fan of Peter Weller. In fact, I have to also mention, if I'm going to mention Peter Weller, the recent series on Netflix, Cabinet of Curiosities, hit and miss. Most of the episodes are okay. One of them's really good, but the best one by far is one of the greatest hours of television I've ever seen in my life. It's called The Viewing. If you only watch one episode of Cabinet of Curiosities, watch The Viewing. It's directed by the guy who did Mandy and Color Out of Space. And it stars Peter Weller. And it is Peter Weller not only at his best, but it is a brilliant performance, one of the greatest performances ever. Peter Weller is amazing in that. You've got to watch The Viewing of Cabinet of Curiosities. All right, so we're down to the last two. I'll save the number one most impactful of that year for last. But first, we unfortunately have to talk about something that had, I mean, this should be number one, but for the wrong reasons. A huge impact on me. And it has nothing to do with the movie itself. I was in middle school, I believe, when Columbine happened. And unfortunately, that's a far too common thing nowadays, but 25 years ago, not so much. I lived in Colorado. I live in Colorado, grew up here, but at the time of Columbine as well, I was living in Colorado, so it was slightly close to home. I didn't live in Denver or anything like that, but I remember it being on the news, and boy did that impact me, because after that, you know, when I was in high school, I made threats or would wear a trench coat or have a gang of followers or whatnot, and then making certain threats, I was immediately suspended. And the reason I was suspended from high school, the official reason, was for being a hazard to the environment. But that's because we were living in the days after Columbine. And now, like I said, unfortunately, in this despicable country, it's something that happens on a daily basis. Mass shootings and school shootings happen on a semi-regular basis, which is extremely tragic. But Columbine, of course, being not, I'm sure not the first, but definitely the first impactful, most memorable that changed the game. But things like that never really hit me. I watched 9/11 live on television. I was, you know, there for Columbine, what, you know, yada yada yada. These things kept happening in the world around me, but they never really, you know, I'm not the kind of person to like, oh my god, I can't, unless it hits me personally, which, you know, I pray to God never does. I can't tell you as a parent how terrifying it is every day my son is at school. That sucks to live in this country and be terrified when your child is at school. So I made it a point to put him in a very specific district that is not only one of the best districts for education, but one of the safest and secured schools. But when my son, I remember the morning, I was very excited. It was my son's 2-month day, whatever you want to call it. It was the day my son was now 2 months. 2 months to the day after my son was born. It was July 20th. Not that he was born, but 2 months after he was born. This was July 20th. And The Dark Knight Rises came out. And I woke up to the news of the Aurora shooting, again in Colorado, the city just north of me. And this one hit me like a ton of bricks. It was very, very hard to get over. It was very hard to wrap my mind around. And I think the reason it hit me so hard was because it was a movie theater. A place where, as you've seen with my now 30 and 10 more remaining videos of all these impactful movies in my life, and how often I would go to the theater to escape. How that's a safe place where people go to get away from their problems and turn off their lives for a couple hours. So the fact that something like that happened in a place like that, I couldn't get over. I prayed for those families. I prayed for those victims. I was in shock for days. I couldn't return to the movies for months. And even when I did, for years, that's all I could think about when I was there. I guess in a way, schools was a tragic thing. Malls, tragedy. Public places, tragedy. Whether it's Vegas or what have you. It's a far too common thing in this country. What you see on the news is just a fraction. It literally happens every day in this country. And this is the only country where these happen this often. But I think it was that was when I knew that there was no safe place. There's no safe place in this country. Whether you're at the grocery store, the movie theater, school, the park, you could get shot at any moment. And I live with that every day. When I go to the grocery store across the street, I'm praying and thinking at any moment there could be someone with a gun opening fire. And now I work at a movie theater, which I have for 4.5 years. And especially being a manager, now it's my responsibility if, God forbid, something horrific or tragic like that happened. I'm in charge. I'm the one who has to make sure my crew are safe, make sure that our public gets out. And I'll never forget my training 4.5 years ago when I started that job, and how taken aback I was that part of our training videos is a mass shooting class. Instructions on what to do in case of a mass shooting. A course that we have to take every 6 months, which unfortunately they won't update. So every 6 months I have to sit through a video that literally shows that photograph of the Aurora movie theater and all of those torn up seats. And it hits me every time. In fact, when my son was a baby, months after it happened, we were taking him to special doctor's appointments at the Children's Hospital in Denver. And one time, I had to swing by that movie theater. And we parked in that parking lot with my infant son in the back. And I had to take a moment of respect and thoughts and prayers at that location, at that Aurora movie theater. And it was, yeah. So now I work at a movie theater, and part of our training is what to do in case of a mass shooting. So in case you were unaware, since they happen everywhere at any time, if there's ever a mass shooting, the first thing you do is run. you run. If you can run, you run. Even if you're running away from a shooter, I was told that 80% of shots fired by a trained police officer miss. And that's a trained police officer. So if you're running away from a gunman, chances are, if they shoot at you, they're going to miss. And if they hit you... Anyway, if you can't run, you hide. First you run. If you can't run, then you hide. You hide. Somewhere secure. Somewhere barricaded. You don't come out until you know that it's police. In fact, part of our training is we're supposed to lock ourselves in the most secure room, which would be the safe room. And we're not supposed to come out unless a police officer slides his card under the door. We've had a couple of scares, but luckily nothing real. It sucks working at a movie theater that's also connected to a mall. And if you can't run, if you can't hide, you fight. You grab whatever you can, you charge, you fight. Fight for your life. So remember that. Run, hide, fight. It could happen to you, it could happen to me, it could happen to any one of us at any moment. Because in this country, I guess we shouldn't really have that gun debate right now. It is a mental health thing, but it's also a gun access thing. Notice how most mass shootings are by people under the age of 25, if not teenagers. Trust me, I went through some effed up stuff when I was a teenager. And if I had access to weapons, I probably would have used them because of my distraught emotional state as a teenager. It's part of being a teenager. You're going through things, especially if you're going through a breakup. And that's another thing that I'll be talking about in a future video of why relationships are the downfall of mankind, and the need for companionship is something that can be overcome. But anyway, because most murders, mass shootings are all a result of someone being heartbroken, or a relationship, or being mad at the breakup, or what have you. It's a very dangerous thing. So if you keep guns away from young, disturbed people, they can't shoot you. Especially guns that can fire 200 rounds in a matter of minutes. But like I said, let's not talk about that. Let's not talk about this at all anymore. Because the number one most impactful film that came out in 2012 on me was Prometheus. Because I was a huge Alien fan my entire life. The Alien series was my very first obsession, even before Star Wars. And when they came back with Ridley Scott to tell the prequel and the origin of the alien with this film Prometheus and the engineers, I love this film. I love it absolutely. I love it, love it, love it, love it, love it. A lot of people complain about the stupid scientists and this and that. Well, yeah, people are stupid, and curiosity will kill you. But it's just an amazing film, and I love it. I love Prometheus. I love Prometheus. I love Prometheus. I love Prometheus. What a great movie. But what tips it over the edge is the fact that because I was so excited about this film, I went with my father, and it came out in June. So this was about a month and a half before the Aurora shooting. But about 2 or 3 weeks after my son was born. And it was the first movie I saw. Like, it was the first time I went to the theater after having been a father. And I'll never forget feeling guilty. Like, why am I not at home with my son? But I just had to see this movie. Saw it with my dad. And the whole movie, I'm just thinking about my baby. Because ever since you have a baby, like when you have an infant, you spend most of your time going, are they breathing? Are they breathing? Especially when they're sleeping. But yeah, I just remember like it was my first time getting out of the house after being a father. And I felt like I shouldn't be away from my baby right now. And I watched the movie and I rushed right back home and got back to my baby. But I loved the film. So it was very impactful. It was my first film in theaters as a father with my father. And it was great. Loved it. At the time, it became one of the highest grossing R-rated films in history, right up there with Passion of the Christ, and now, of course, you've got Deadpool. But yeah, 2012. A tragic year in some ways. A great year for film, and a great year for me, because it gave me my son. And as we all know, God willing, forever, but Flynn lives. Okie dokie.